Okay, I'm challenging you guys. This is I'm challenging you guys to come along on a thought experiment with me. One that I've been conducting with myself for years. And it has to do with a whole universe of alternate dominant chord substitutions. Okay? And I'm just gonna freeball this. But I want you to come along for the ride and check out what I've discovered or what I've observed. And, you know, maybe you can add to the comments, tell me what you think. So, you know, a lot of us learn, you know, the most common dominant chord substitution. Probably you may have heard of this before, you know, the tritone substitution. And so I'm assuming anybody that's still watching this right now is familiar with this concept of the tritone substitution. You know, which makes it for a totally interchangeable chord that you can use in place of the 5 chord that has the same tension building function. It creates this like cadence to the 1, okay? So with that said, if you're still with me, I'm going to start I'm going to take you along this story here, okay? And it goes like this. So I started to notice, okay, that I could get away with, instead of just playing the typical tritone substitution, I started to realize there were other chords I could play that were more or less just a 5 chord being, you know, voiced in a kind of a different way. For example, you know, I think a lot of us, you know, have probably seen this before, which is really common. I think it's more common maybe in jazz. I don't know, but this one here, this minor major 6 chord. You know, it's basically a 5 chord. You know, somebody might look at that and say, well, you played a 2 chord. Well, I think I just played a 5 chord. I just didn't play its root. Okay. And that gets used. You know, you've probably heard, you know, people play a 2 chord and maybe a minor 6 chord right over top. It's basically a 5 chord, you know, without a root. So to me, that one's really obvious. I think we've seen that one. Same thing for you know, the 4 chord. Your typical 4 chord, that Lydian. You know, it has a natural cadence to it. It's called that one I just played is called plagal cadence. You know, the dominant, that's your perfect cadence. But that 4 is really, I mean, what is that? If the piano player is playing like the 5 chord, he's hitting this, and you're playing, well, really, you're just playing again another rootless 5 chord. You got the 7th in there, you have the 9th in there, and you have an 11th, right? You end up with kind of a sussy sounding 5 chord. Gets used all the time. So, you know, your 4 chord is really just another 5 chord. So your 2 chord is basically a 5 chord. Your 4 chord is, here's another one you guys have probably seen and have probably learned to kind of recognize as just the other way to play the dominant chord, and that is to play the diminished. You know, if I'm targeting G major here, if I play that diminished triad, it's really, I think we all know that's just it's just another 5 chord. It just doesn't have the fifth in it. You know what I mean? It doesn't have the root in it, I should say. It's got the fifth of this chord, this diminished chord, root, minor third, diminished fifth, right? So if we look at these, and this is what I started to ask myself in this thought experiment. I looked at those, and what do they all have in common? They all have this 4. They all have this 4, you know, in the interval of a fourth in relation to the target chord I'm going towards. They all have that. They all share that. They all kind of depend on that from my observation to create that resolution. You know, this sound of like, you know, that resolution. Regardless if you're using it as a or you might be using it as the third, or you might be using it as the root of the 4 chord. So there's something about this, and here's the other thing you may have heard or come across, this idea of the 4 being this avoid note. Don't play the 4 on a major. You can play the 4 on a minor chord, you know, like when you've landed on it and it sounds pretty consonant, as they say. But on a major chord, it's kind of like, it's off limits, kind of, so to speak. And I think that this is where its power lies, right? It's this instability that it creates. So I asked myself this question. I'm sure that this, by the way, is going to be like the worst video I've ever published. And I'm praying that some of you guys are hanging on. But I digress. So this 4, it's the common denominator in all of these. And I start to realize like the 5, that fifth interval, right? The root of the dominant chord in its natural position, it seems less and less important. So the 4, that 4 interval seems like, this is like key. So I ask myself, what if I start just playing any kind of chord? Just make sure that whatever that chord is, I'm using that 4th interval. And so I start playing around with some ideas to hear what does the cadence sound like? What does the resolution sound like? So we know what a natural we know what that natural plagal cadence sounds like. Well, what if we make that a minor chord? Does that work? Sure. I just played the first inversion of it here. So bear with me as we take a look at that for just a second, okay? So I just instead of a major chord, I played a minor chord there. Well, what does that really give me? Let's assume we've got another bass player in the corner and he just plays the 5 while we played that line. Right? Well, so what do we get there? We get a root, a flat 9, an 11, right? and a 7. I mean, sure, why, like that can function as a dominant sound, right? I mean, use your ears. I just used that 5 to prefix that minor sound off the 4 there. That's a dominant. But I created that those dominant sounds or that shape with the idea of like, oh, I'm going to play, instead of playing my plagal typical major, I just switched it to a minor. Okay, well, what if we play a diminished triad instead? What do we get? Let's hear it out. So we might go do boo boo ba 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 boo boo. And there's, you know, different ways I could play that. And there I hit that 5 again. I just inserted it to see what it does. So here I'm playing the 3, the flat 5. Remember, we're imagining the root, our dominant root, in the 4 position here. So playing the minor 3rd, the flat 5, the root. That's the. I just added the 5th to it, just because I know it's acting like a 5 chord. I get this. You know, does that have a cadence? Does that create the same kind of dissonance? I think it does. I hear it. So right there, just right there, we know that we can play, rooting off of the 4th here, we can play 2 other dominant subs that will work. Okay? So instead of your typical tritone sub to the 1, well, we've got these other ones like, you know, we've got like I just played the natural, right? I just kind of played like a couple 5s. That's what I just did there was very much like what this was. Only difference is I used a 4 chord, natural, minor 4 chord to the 1. It sounds like a 5 to me. They have the same. It has the similar push and resolution, but it's like it opens up like these. Like it opens you up to some like temporary chromaticism. Yeah, so you know, I could go from major to minor to diminished. You know, like I could start like flipping these all around, you know? Right? Just played the major. They all have that 4 in them. These can make for some like really cool like reinterpretations, reharmonizations of your typical 5 chords. Okay, so my thought experiment is not concluded yet. So if you've lasted this long, you haven't stopped the video to go, oh, I got to try that out. It gets deeper. So then I ask myself, what if I just play any chord, or what if I don't like restrict it to the root? What if I allow those? What if I just make sure that I'm playing any one of those chords, but I ensure that that 4, that avoid tone, is any one of the chord tones that I'm playing. So, for example, what if the 4 becomes the 3rd chord tone of each of those variations? What kinds of resolutions do I get? Because I still have that 4 there, right? So if I stick with this resolution and say, okay, well, what if that's the 3rd? Let's say this is going to be the 3rd of a major chord. Well, then I get this. Right? See, that's the 3rd. The 4th is the 3rd of this major chord, which happens to be in that tritone position. So we know that works. Right? We know that one works. What if we make that minor, the minor 3rd? Well, it's minor, it just becomes a 2 chord. Nothing special there. Again, it's that 5 chord without a root. I just added the 5th in there to help you hear it. So nothing special there. What if this becomes the minor 3rd of a diminished sound? How do I want to voice it? Let's voice that like this. But that's really just a dominant flat 9 without a root or its 3rd. If I add the 3rd and the root to it, you get something like this. There's nothing, that's very dominant sounding. So right there I've like moved around and used that 4th as the 3rd in those 3 different chord types. So I can keep going and see like, well, what if I use this as the 5th of any of those? So let's say that this is the 5th of a major chord. Well, a 5th of a major chord would give me, right? I'm playing an inversion there, the 2nd inversion, right? 5 root 3. That has that like backdoor dominant sound. So how does that measure up as a 5 chord if I add the 5 to it? It's got it has this sort of like 9 Sorry. It's got that. It's like a 5 with a sharp 9. Totally works. Totally works. But, you know, I think it's more fun to leave the 5 out of it. Because chances are somebody else in the band is going to be playing that 5 because that's what they do. And if they don't, awesome. So that was, what if we make that a minor chord? That's the 5th of a minor chord. We get this. Right? That's just a flat. That works. What do we get there? We get this when we add that 5th in there, we get a 7, the root. We get this raised 9th. We get a flat 5. We get the 7th of that. Very cool. And then of course we can make that the diminished 5th, right? So if we're playing the 5th, well, now we have a recognize that as just the regular diminished chord. That's just an inversion of your typical diminished chord. So they all work. Whether that 4 is the root, the 3rd, or the 5th of those three chord types, major, minor, diminished. If you're still with me, which I highly doubt you are, but here's the thing. What we start to recognize is that we just uncover a whole pile of like different like dominant sounds, different ways of playing out our dominant sounds, and we can use these, we can stitch these together. We can kind of say, you know, if the 2 is really just a 5 chord, then all your 2-5 progressions are really just 5 chord substitutions. That's really all they are. So you can start stitching these together in many combinations. And by the way, you can use any kind of chord here. This is where my thought experiment continues to go, as I've realized, like, if you drop that 4 in, it's kind of like you can basically use any chord as long as that 4 is in there and it's being used as a chord tone. Yeah. That's as far as I want to take this thought experiment. It does go deeper, but I don't want to blow anybody's head apart here. If people are interested in unlocking the last piece of this, leave me a comment, because it gets wild. Stay cool. Subscribe. Share my content. I don't make any money doing this stuff. I do this for the love of the music.